Ever since Invincible Season 3 had ended, there had been one massive debate that has spawned. That was the debate between Omni-Man versus current Invincible, and if current Invincible could beat Omni-Man from Season 1, or just how well they would do. In this video, I want to cover that debate and more importantly cover the arguments on both sides. This is also going to count as my How Strong is Omni-Man video because if I'm going to be honest with you guys, a lot of Omni-Man's feats just aren't that more impressive than Invincible's feats. At least the feats that happened in Season 3, so he doesn't really upscale Mark from a feats perspective. So if you want to know where I think Omni-Man scales, first watch my How Strong is Invincible video and then come back here to see who is stronger between Invincible and Omni-Man. But either way, Omni-Man does scale to Invincible's feats. Now starting out this video, I'm going to be honest with you guys, I do think Omni-Man is stronger than Invincible and currently beats Invincible, so I'm going to go over the reasons why, and then I'm going to go over the counter arguments that Invincible has, because I know there are actually a bunch of counter arguments that might be able to upscale him. I want to give my opinion on them, and more importantly, why I just don't think a good chunk of them work. However, up first, I am going to go into why I do generally think Omni-Man is still stronger. Most important thing of all is that I'm going to be mainly going over the TV show scaling and not the comic book scaling. The TV show has some different power scaling feats and metrics from the comics, so I think that is pretty important to mention. Now the real big reason why I think Omni-Man is still currently stronger than Mark is because the show has not gone out of its way to directly say it yet, and if Mark was stronger than Omni-Man by this point, I think they would. Especially because there are several opportunities to have direct comparisons to Omni-Man, yet they still showed to have Omni-Man as a top dog. For example, when Cecil is comparing Conquest to another Viltrumite to Adam Eve, he just straight up says that they think even he would take Nolan down, just as a way to show how strong Omni-Man was up to this point. Furthermore, it's also shown that Conquest had a lot more expectations with Omni-Man's son because they were the son of Omni-Man, and Mark didn't really reach those expectations. Down to the point where when Mark was fighting back against Conquest, Conquest was starting to question why they sent him there considering how weak Mark actually was in comparison to him. Now, I'm not saying that Omni-Man is stronger than Conquest, but the important part is the fact that Conquest had higher expectations due to Mark being Omni-Man's son, and those expectations were not achieved. Furthermore, the direct comparison point for Mark up to this point has still been Anissa. The goalpost for Mark has been Anissa and surpassing Anissa, and whether it's debatable whether he's surpassed Anissa or not by this point, Anissa is still weaker than Omni-Man. Which has another line of scaling you can take. A heavily injured Omni-Man was able to fight alongside Alan the Alien. Granted, Alan the Alien was also injured, however it should also be noticed since both of them were injured, that means both of them were rather nerfed. Meanwhile, Alan the Alien, when he was holding back power so he'd be underestimated by Anissa, was able to do quite a bit of damage to her. After all, Alan the Alien held back to such a point that they genuinely believed the weapons on the Viltrumite ship could kill him. So another line of scaling you could take is that Mark is still around the same level of Anissa. Whether you think they're weaker or stronger, they should be still relatively comparable to each other. Meanwhile, Omni-Man scales relative to Alan, who should scale above Anissa. Basically, you can either chain scale them, or you can just say that Omni-Man is narratively still implied to be stronger than Mark, and that if he was weaker than him, they would have said so by this point. You also could potentially argue that a 138% increase of strength shouldn't be enough for Mark to be able to catch up to Omni-Man by that point. However, I don't think that argument is as stable to use as the other ones, but it's still one that is pretty good. You also could just argue that even if they were equal, Omni-Man should just gap him in skill. He's been doing hero work for 20 years and has been conquering planets for significantly longer. And while Mark is certainly used to fighting against skilled opponents, he doesn't really do too well against them, with the only two examples being Conquest and Fula. But Conquest is letting himself get hit, and Fula was only when Mark got a Rage Amp and was probably stronger than her too. However, is this it for Mark? Is there no way that Mark can ever beat Omni-Man? Well, there are certainly some arguments that I have heard going around, and even some that I thought of myself, but I want to talk about why those arguments don't work as well as people think they do, and let's go into the one I've heard the most common out of the arguments. Now the first, and this is the real big one that I've heard a lot of people use, which is the end of Season 3 statement. At the end of Season 3, we see Damien Darkblood talking to some Demon King, where they mention on the Earth there has been a being stronger than the Earth has ever seen for eons. And what's often used even more proof that this is talking about Mark is the fact that in the next season they're talking about having an arc where Mark is basically sent to hell like standard comic book stuff, which led a lot of people to the conclusion that he must be talking about Mark Grayson as the strongest being on Earth. After all, there's going to be an entirely different TV show arc that's going to be based around Mark going to hell, so he has to obviously be the strongest person, right? Well, there is a couple reasons why I just don't think this fully works. Up first, I need to ask the question, does Damien even know about what's happening past Season 1? Because remember, he was sent back down there before the end of Season 1. So for all we know, he's not aware of any of the things that have happened past the point that he was sent back down, which means he could have very easily been talking about Omni-Man. Not to mention the fact that that statement doesn't really exclude Omni-Man either way, considering the fact that it's the strongest thing the Earth had seen in eons, which means Omni-Man was just the strongest person the Earth had ever seen since eons ago. which the strongest person before could have just easily been Immortal. Now I know there are villains who have definitely surpassed Immortal by this point, but for all we know they just got powers after Omni-Man landed. We have no idea how long Mr. Liu has had powers for. So you could just easily argue that he is still talking about Omni-Man. And while the next arc is going to be about Mark being sent to Hell, we don't really know how far that goes. We don't know how he's going to be sent there. For all we know, they tried to summon Omni-Man, but they ended up summoning the closest thing to him, that being Mark, since they share DNA. We have no idea how that arc is actually going to go, so we have to wait and see. But just assuming they're talking about Mark because of that just doesn't really work in my opinion. However, there is a second reason why I think this doesn't work, and this reason is actually probably a lot more crucial. Even if Damien Darkblood knows about what's been happening in Season 3, that statement is still probably not talking about Mark. The reason I say that is because there is a being on Earth that is guaranteed stronger than Mark right now that is still alive and held in custody recovering, and that being is Conquest. So even if you wanted to argue that Damien Darkblood is aware of everything that has been happening on the planet, that statement will be referring to Conquest unless you can argue that Mark is above him, which is not really a way to argue that in my opinion. After all, Conquest is somebody who is definitely stronger than Omni-Man, so they would also fit as the strongest being the Earth had seen for eons. So even if you argue that Damien Darkblood is aware of what's happening, you'd also have to get past the hurdle of arguing Mark above Conquest, which if I'm going to be honest, is significantly harder than arguing Mark above Omni-Man. So either way, in my opinion, the statement is null and void for Mark scaling, especially when you factor in we have no idea how that story is going to go. Other than Mark is going to go to Hell, we have no idea if that statement is in reference to him or who that statement is in reference to yet. Maybe we're going to find out more about this in future seasons and we can actually use that statement, but for now, because we know nothing about it, we're going to have to wait and see. Now up next, I'm going to go into the second argument that I have heard pretty often, which is backscaling off of Conquest. Basically, the argument goes like this. Cecil states that Conquest is stronger than Omni-Man. Conquest wasn't showing its full power at the time, and only really going casual against Mark. When Mark was enraged, he was able to match a stronger Conquest than the one Cecil was talking about. Or at least match to a certain degree. He was able to break through his arm, but he was still getting semi-overpowered. So basically, casual Conquest should scale above Omni-Man, who Mark should scale relative to casual Conquest. Which means Mark should be stronger than Omni-Man currently. However, this line of scaling does have quite a few problems. The first problem that it does have is it's assuming Cecil is only going by visuals. The main reason why I say that's a problem is because we know for a fact that Cecil has bone density scanners, that's how they scanned Anissa, that's how they scaled Mark's chance of surviving a fight against her in Season 2, and there's no reason to assume that Cecil lost those scanners. If anything, they should be even better than they are now since they've had several months to develop their technology. So simulations are more than likely going off of that and should be able to tell what full power Conquest is and is going off that for how strong he should be in comparison to Omni-Man rather than just going off what he's showing. Furthermore, it's also debatable whether Cecil can even visualize the fight or if his cameras can keep up considering how fast Conquest and Mark move, since Mark when he was fighting Anissa was moving too fast for the cameras, let alone these two, Conquest should be faster than Anissa was, if not at least moving at relative speeds. You could also argue that Cecil's scaling is just inaccurate, however that one's a lot harder to prove considering Cecil has not been wrong up to this point. The only thing that he might have been wrong on was talking about the Hail Mary, because he thought the Hail Mary was only going to last for 5 minutes against Omni-Man, yet it was almost capable of murdering him. However, we also know Viltrumites get weaker the more and more injuries they take. After all, that was Angstром's plan in Season 2 in order to kill Mark. That's how one of the Mark variants were also beaten. So it could just be that Cecil didn't know that and thought Omni-Man was still at full strength. The final thing is Mark doesn't really scale to casual Conquest at all. After all, even though Mark was able to break one of Conquest's robotic arms, that was at the cost of his own arm. Remember, at the end of that fight, he ended up shattering both of his arms and working through the pain. Those are not blows he can land casually. So while he scales to that level, he is not going to scale to that level for long. He can only scale to that level for 1 to 2 hits. Now, of course, there is also the argument that I brought up earlier on, which is the fact that Mark has better feats than Omni-Man up to this point. Like, Omni-Man's best feat currently is still a Texas Meteor feat, which is good, but you can argue that from a narrative perspective that Omni-Man is still just stronger than Mark, which is supported as well by the Allen scaling, which means he should just upscale all of Mark's feats. He also has an inverse chain scale that would be able to let him go that high being through Allen the Alien, so there are some reasons why that argument doesn't work. Both the narrative doesn't support it, and the fact there is a way to get Omni-Man above him through Allen the Alien. Now I'm gonna go into some minor arguments that I thought of that aren't as good in comparison or as used as often, but they are still pretty interesting, at least in my opinion. The first argument is use Sinister Mark in order to make a scaling chain. Sinister Mark killed the version of Omni-Man, our Mark scales above him, therefore they scale above Omni-Man. There are two problems with this scaling chain. Even if you do say that Sinister Mark is stronger than Omni-Man just because of that, even though it would be hard to say whether that Omni-Man is on par with him or not, there's nothing that actually directly confirms that our Mark should be stronger than Sinister Mark. Donald only stated that our Mark was stronger than Flaxen Mark, therefore Mark doesn't inherently scale the Sinister Mark. On top of that, you can also just argue Sinister Mark's Omni-Man was just weaker. And then the final argument that I have in mind is one that's based around a certain character known as the Immortal, the bane of my existence. There is a statement out there, I genuinely can't find the statement myself, that states that the Immortal and Omni-Man have equal punching strength, just the Immortal is less durable. I don't think that's true, if I'm being honest, but still, I'm gonna bring it up anyways. Mark is stated to be stronger than the Immortal. However, there is some issues with that, including the fact that that same Mark that is stated to be stronger than the Immortal gets outperformed by Omni-Man in that fight, so this argument is also null and void. Unless you think Omni-Man in Season 2 is significantly stronger than Omni-Man in Season 1. You also could just argue that Omni-Man was nerfed against the Immortal. As we know, when Viltrumites take more damage, they get nerfed, and Omni-Man was fighting against the Hail Mary before this, and he ended up being heavily weakened because he almost died against the Hail Mary, so he was more than likely just nerfed against Immortal. Welcome to why while Immortal is strong, he doesn't scale to Omni-Man at all. So at least right now, in my opinion, there's no real way to get Mark above Omni-Man. Maybe there's some other arguments I might have missed and the comments can tell me otherwise, but there's not any way I can see right now. However, that might change in the future. Maybe there are some arguments that I missed, so I'm curious to see what you guys think in the comment section down below. And also, if you're curious about how strong Omni-Man, Battle Beast, and Alan the Alien are, basically take all of the feats that I put from the How Strong is Invincible video and upscale those three characters from that.